Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is I'm the director of the Hellenic Centre, and it's just such a great pleasure to be hosting tonight's talk with Antony Penrose, entitled "The Road is Wider Than Long." Anthony Penrose, who is here today in his capacity as the co-director of the Lee and Roland archives and the Penrose collection at Pablo's house, is also the son of American photographer Lee and Roland and British surrealist artist Roland Penrose. Two names that you cannot avoid or come across, either when you're researching 20th century photography, or when you're looking into British surrealism, or the foundation of the Institute of Contemporary Art, for example, which Roland was one of the co-founders. Anthony will present his father's book, "The Road is Wider Than Long," a love poem created as a photo book that recounts a journey the couple made through the Balkans in the 1930s and went to Greece and Romania. At the bar, you may have seen 4 photographs, which were very kindly loaned to us by Pablo's house from that journey. There are many more, as you can imagine, in the archives, and of course the book, they're presented there. Now I would like to introduce Antony in a bit more detail. Antony is the co-director, as I just said, of the Lee and Roland archives and the Penrose collection. He is a curator of photography, an artist and filmmaker, and lectures widely in various setups, including cultural venues and academic institutions. Antony has written numerous books. Few of those are out there at the balcony. I know some of you had the chance to browse and buy. The books will be there at the end of the talk as well. His biography, he's written, of course, numerous books, articles, and 2 plays on the subject of his parents and their associates. His biography of his mother, The Lives of Lee and Roland, has been made into a feature film titled Lee in 2024, starring Kate Winslet as Lee and Roland, in which he was the factual consultant. Broadcasting includes BBC Radio 4 Women's Hour, Today and Front Row, and on television he has appeared on BBC's The One Show, Flog It, The Culture Show, Picasso, The Beauty and the Beast, and on CNN. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please hold your questions until that time. As I said, you can continue browsing books and consider buying them after the talk. Anthony has actually said he can sign some as well, so thank you for that. And we will continue our conversations at the bar, which will stay for another hour after the talk, so feel free to join us there. Now, some practicalities. Please, if you hear the fire alarm, you have to exit from the entrance where you came, just right there on my right, and straight out in the district. Across the road is the assembly point. Please switch off your phones so we can start. And finally, join me in welcoming Antony Penrose with a very warm round of applause. Welcome, Antony.
Well, hello. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you all here, and it's so nice to be invited here as part of our Farley's 75 years anniversary. And it's a very special occasion because I brought with me a little book. It's called "The Road is Wider Than Long." It's a slim volume of surrealist poetry, and it's believed to be the only photo book by a British surrealist, and it was created by my father, Roland Penrose. I'd like you to meet him. He was born in 1900 in London and was very British, despite being a surrealist artist. And this is a love story about him and Lee Miller, the woman he met at a surrealist ball in Paris in 1937 and who became my mum. My dad was one of 4 brothers. The youngest hadn't been born at the time of this photo. The middle one, Alec, he became a Norfolk landowner. The little guy on the right, he became one of Britain's foremost genetic scientists. And to prove how clever he was, he engineered all the brains onto his side of the family and left us with nothing on our side. The result being my cousin is a Fellow of the Royal Society and a Nobel Prize winner. He's Roger Penrose, the mathematician, and so on. And we all get by not being able to add up anything. Anyway, The one on the left, that's my dad, and I'm always astonished that he did not become a transvestite having dressed like that as a kid. His father was a painter, James Doyle Penrose. He was Irish, and he married my grandmother. They met because they were both Quakers, and they met in Britain, and he married her, and she was the daughter of a banker, and that was fortunate because she was very wealthy. So Roland grew up in some comfort, but at the age of 18, it was just getting towards the end of the First World War, and he decided to join up. Being a Quaker, he couldn't be a combatant, so he joined the Friends Ambulance Unit and saw service in northern Italy. When he was demobbed, he went to Queen's College, Cambridge. He wanted to study art. There were no courses in art, so he signed on for architecture, and he nearly died of boredom. And the guy who saved his life was this man, Roger Fry, another Quaker. Fry was an extraordinary person. He was the man who brought post-impressionism to Britain. He also had his own private collection of works by Braque and Picasso. And he showed these to Roland, and he found this wonderfully exciting because it was a bit of an antidote to his dad's really stuck-to-the-ground religious heavy-duty painting. And it was Fry who suggested to Roland that on his graduation he went to Paris and go to art school. And Roland's dad, my grandfather, was horrified. But he gave my dad an allowance on the condition that he promised to never go to the kind of schools where they used live, nude female models in life classes. So Roland grabbed the allowance, promised faithfully, shot off to Paris, and his first teacher was André Lot. Lot introduced Roland, as you can see, to what he later described as the startlingly heterosexual lifestyle of Montmartre, but also to Cubism, because this was the big style invented in about 1908 by Picasso and Braque. It was now the big deal. But after a year or two of this, Roland, this poor English boy from a sheltered background, was nearly burned out. So he went to the south of France, to the Mediterranean coast, to Cassis-sur-Mer, with a Greek friend of his, the artist Janko Vada. Roland bought this little villa, and they settled down. And he and Janko built a studio in the garden, and they started painting. And Roland painted in a style that owes a little to architecture, a little to Cubism. A style that's friendly and nice, is exploring odd things like sea monsters, leviathans. Maybe he felt that he was the odd thing out there in Cassis. And also, like many expatriates, he was concerned with arrivals and departures. It was a lovely style, but not one that was ever going to earn him the place that he currently occupies in the history of British modern art. For that, there needed to be a catalyst. And one day that catalyst showed up outside the gate of Villa Le Mimose and rang the little brass doorbell. And in that moment, that little brass doorbell signaled the start of a chain of events that was going to later bring surrealism to Britain. The person who rang the doorbell was this lady. Her name was Valentine Bouet. She was a surrealist poet. She was fascinated with philosophy and the Hindu religion. They married. And to begin with, they lived in Cassis. And you can see Valentine sitting in the back of the car in this picture, and she's in a filthy temper. She really was very often in a filthy temper. And today we would probably understand that she had some severe hormonal disruption. But in those days, it was scientifically described as a filthy temper. And Roland thought it was rather exciting, from the very constrained and rather sort of heavy-duty background that he came from. Here was this woman who could get wildly excited about nothing with no real good reason. But after a while, they left Cassis. They bought a tumble-down chateau in Valentine's homeland of Gascony. And she was very happy there because it was wild and remote, and she loved being close to nature. And Roland painted her like this. Valentine was already a poet of some distinction among the surrealists. She knew André Breton and Paul Éluard, and in fact, Éluard had written the preface for Valentine's first published book, Herbe à la Lune, Moon Grass. Roland was so thrilled and so proud of this production that he commissioned a special binding for the book, and it made it into a beautiful object in his own right. Éluard was a close friend to Roland, that's him in the middle, and also Man Ray, on the right of the picture, became one of Roland's most important people. And there, between Éluard and Man Ray, you see Picasso. And in fact, all of these people were to come into Roland's life about this period, simply because he was just another one of them, another surrealist hanging out in France. But in particular, the man with the white hair became a very close friend. His name was Max Ernst, preeminent of all the surrealist painters. His wife, the lady in the stripes, is called Marie Berthe, and they became very close to both Roland and to Valentine. And Max showed Roland a lot of surrealist techniques. This one's called frottage. It's like brass rubbing. You put the paper on a coarse, rough surface and you rub it all over with pencil or crayon, and you discover the surface underneath. And it's wonderful for making these dreamlike sequences, because surrealism was all about exploring dreams, exploring the subconscious. And indeed, it's all about you providing your own answer, because there are many questions in all of these paintings. Is that a boat? Is it a bath? Is that a cloud of steam? Or is it Roland's erotic fantasy? And what's it all doing in a desert anyway? Whatever answer you come up with, that's the right one, because that's the way it works. Roland painted Valentine like this. You can make eye contact with her, you can look straight into her eye, but notice a profile. She can also see in a different direction to you, into another dimension. And this is perfectly legitimate, because she was clairvoyant. She could see into the future with the use of her tarot cards. But idyllic though it seemed on the surface, there was much tension underneath the marriage, because Valentine had become disenchanted with the surrealists. She wanted a spiritual life. She had studied Sanskrit and the Hindu religion, and indeed she wanted her own private search for nirvana. Roland, on the other hand, was so into surrealism because it was a political movement. They wanted to change the world, make it a fairer, better place, but seeking to salvage his relationship. He took Valentine to India, and they were there for nearly 3 months, and during that time it is as though he had willingly left surrealism behind in Paris and reverted to painting in this lovely pictorial style. Valentine loved India. She wanted to stay. But they returned, and they had to admit that they had reached the end of their road. Valentine went back to India, and they divorced in 1938. But in 1936, Roland left Paris, came back to England, not in retreat, but as the ambassador of the surrealist movement, which was little known in this country at that time. And this was the moment the little brass doorbell at Villa Les Mimosas delivered its promise of bringing surrealism to Britain, because Roland and a bunch of others created the first international surrealist exhibition here in London, June 1936. And André Breton showed up to open it. It was a blast. Everybody who was at the front of the movement was there. You can see Salvador Dali. There's Paul Éluard next to Roland, Herbert Reed, Edouard Mezens, and in the front row, Nouche Éluard, Paul's wife, Eileen Agar, and Sheila Legge, 2 British women surrealist artists. And Salvador Dali turned up dressed in a diving suit with 2 Irish wolfhounds. He chose the diving suit, he said, to descend to the depths of the subconscious. He very nearly made a job of it because he nearly suffocated inside. After the show closed, Roland went back to Paris to visit Max Ernst. They heard there was a fancy dress party. They dressed up as beggars, as tramps, and they turned up at this very posh house near the Étoile, and they were let in. But Roland hadn't been there for very long when he suddenly said that he experienced a sense of having been struck by lightning, because he met the gaze of a pair of piercingly blue eyes set in a lightly tanned face under a soft coif of blonde hair. He had met Lee Miller, and he was never the same again. Lee Miller was born in 1907 in America, in a little town in upstate New York called Poughkeepsie. Her dad was an engineer. Her mum was a nurse. There were two brothers, John and Eric, and Lee played the boys' games. She was a real tomboy, but she grew up into being this tall, elegant, beautiful young woman. And one day she was walking through Manhattan on her way to the Art Students League, where she was a student, when she stepped off the pavement in front of an oncoming truck. This guy had been watching her. He snatched her back with seconds to spare, and she did the girly thing. She fainted in his arms, and he looked down and he saw this beautiful woman. Good choice, Lee, because the guy's name was Condé Nast. He was the owner of Vogue magazine and Vanity Fair, and before very long, Lee was front cover Vogue, March 1927. She was not yet 20 years old. And that brought her to the attention of chief photographer Edward Steichen. And his photographs made her into what we would today call a supermodel, coast to coast in Vogue and Vanity Fair. And then after a while, about a year and a half, she got bored with this, and other reasons too, but she decided that she wanted to become a photographer. I would rather make a picture than be one, she said. Boarded a liner to Paris in search of this guy, American photographer Man Ray, well known for his surrealist work. She went and found Man Ray. "Hi, I'm your new student," she said. "No, you're not. I don't take students. And anyway, I'm going to Biarritz for my holidays." "Yes, I know," she said. "I'm coming with you." And so she did. Very quickly, she established her own studio, independently of Man Ray. She used to borrow his props for her pack shots. And she used to do fashion. And to save money, she used herself as her own model. And she got published in Vogue, America, less than 1 year after she had started up her studio. Start as you mean to go on, Lee. Well, it was these shots that paid the bills. But it was these shots that Lee really liked doing, because this is where her surrealist eye kicked in. You may have heard of the objet trouvé, the found object. There's things that surrealist people pick up. You may do it yourself. And it's a little pebble or a piece of wood or a small machine part or something, and you keep it because it contains the marvelous in the ordinary. And you put it somewhere special in your home, and just by collecting it, that has made it your work of art. And Lee did... Hello, what's happened here? I'm so sorry. That is quite a surrealist moment. For some reason, it's just... I'd like you to meet my wife. And the cat's name is Louise. And I just now got to find the right place that we were at. Where were we? We were some kind of mucking around with Man Ray, weren't we? Yeah, here we go. Bunch of rats, that's what it was. Yeah, anyway, so she did the objet trouvé, making it into the image trouvé. And so she went around the place finding objects that she could turn into weird photographs. Things that are necessary to have no meaning except what you give them yourself. Sometimes you can see the surrealist mind more clearly at work. The figures here are in a mural that's part of a clinic. They're painted on the wall, but the pushchairs are real, the woman is real, and the baby is real, dressed in white. But being in white, it blends seamlessly with the painted figures. Thus it merges reality and illusion. And that is exactly what the surrealists want, to destroy the distinction between those two things. Lee and Man Ray rediscovered the technique of solarization. It became the hallmark of their artistic association. Together they were a most brilliant team. But as lovers, it didn't work. Because Lee would not be tied down, she would not be owned by any one person. She demanded her freedom, and it nearly drove Man Ray nuts. And finally, after 3 years, she quit and went back to New York. And Man Ray expiated his grief at losing her by painting this picture, It's big. It's about that size. It took him 2 years to paint. It's called observatory time because the lips are hovering above the Observatoire de Montparnasse, and that puts them more or less above his studio. So the lips are in the sky, and they are, of course, Lee's lips, enlarged from a photograph. But in the painting, he's given her a slight tilt to the axis, so she can fly freely in this beautiful early morning sky. It's the moment he kissed her goodbye, forgave her, gave her freedom, and continued to love her for the rest of his life until he died 1 year before she did. In New York, it was a tough time to start a business because the depression of the 30s was still full on. But Lee found a way, and she began by doing pack shots for advertising, and her kind of Parisian chic put her way ahead of the American photographers. Then the portrait photographers showed up. This lady's Mary Taylor, and here's Lillian Harvey. They were actresses on Broadway who wanted arresting images to send to Hollywood casting directors. The studio was the most fantastic success. But after 2 years, this guy showed up. Aziz Eloui Bey. He had met Lee in Paris when Lee had photographed Aziz's wife, Nimet. He had divorced Nimet. He showed up in New York. He asked Lee to marry him. To everyone's shock, horror, she did, closed the studio, and went to live in Cairo, in Villa Al Bates, in the smart area of Doki. And Lee slipped into a pampered lifestyle. At first she enjoyed this privileged existence, but soon the social life of the expatriate community began to pale, and she became bored with the vacuous lifestyle of endless bridge tournaments and partying. So she grabbed her camera and she took off into the desert. It was tough. The cars were not four-wheel drive. There were not really any good compasses. The tracks got wiped out by the sandstorms. And she kept finding surrealist images. On a cotton farm, she called it the Cloud Factory. It looks like the clouds have been stuffed into bags waiting for shipment, but some are trying to get out and join their friends. She went way off into the great sand desert, to the oasis of Siwa. And on the way back, she took one of her best-known photographs. It's the torn fly screen in a little rest house built for King Fahd. It gives you a sense of wanting to escape, to burst through that hole and disappear down the road in the background. In the sky is a cloud, or is it a white bird, or is it a cloud? And then there's that frame. That frame was a little hatch that you put your hand through to open the storm shutters. But the flap's fallen off by now. Instead, it's a portrait frame, and it encloses space. And that's her gift to you. That space is her gift for you to populate with your own dreams, your own imaginings. But even then, Lee still pined for Paris. And Aziz, ever understanding, ever indulgent, did a very unusual thing. He bought her an airline ticket to Marseille. She flew to Marseille, took the train to Paris, and on the night she arrived, she met Roland Penrose. Well, it was love at first sight. Deep, passionate, and very lasting. Sorry. They were inseparable for the rest of that enchanted summer. First, they went to Cornwall, and then they drove across France to Mougins on the Côte d'Azur, meeting up with their friends. On the left is Paul Éluard and Nouche. On the right, in the white hat, that's Man Ray, and his girlfriend there is Adi Fidelin, the first serious girlfriend in his life in the 5 years since Lee has been absent. And there in the background, this is what an uptight Englishman looks like when he's hanging out with a woman of his dreams in the south of France. I think he's happy. There should have been two others at the picnic, Picasso and Dora Maar, but that morning they'd had a furious row, so they stayed behind to cool off. Paul, a close friend of Picasso's, was regarded by many as the preeminent of the surrealist poets. He was married to Nouche, a talented woman of great beauty who modelled for Man Ray and Picasso. And Lee and Paul had known each other from when she lived in Paris. She was an acute judge of literature and always admired Paul's work, and he was a key friend of both her and Roland. And without Paul's connections and influence, Roland would never have got the loans that he needed when he curated the International Surrealist exhibition in 1936. Surrealism was filled with strong political ideas for which Paul's poetry provided a means of expression. But in Roland's poetry we find shared ideals for peace, freedom, and justice. Roland's lines of poetry are masked, often oblique, but they have a direct and universal appeal. His work is non-esoteric and it's timeless, appealing to us today with the same values that were important to him in the 1930s. Alas, the holiday ended. It was soon time to go home. Picasso and Dora went back to Paris, and Lee returned to Cairo at the end of August, and meeting her long-suffering and ever-forgiving Aziz. She and Roland kept in touch, writing countless letters, and then in June the following year, Lee wrote, "Roland, darling, I'll be in Athens in July. I'm bringing my Packard two-seater and a lot of luggage. I want to see some of Romania, Transylvania, and the Carpathians." On receiving that letter, Roland dropped everything. More than 40 years later, it was still fresh in his mind. He wrote in the afterword to the 1980 edition of The Road is Wider Than Long, "I at once booked my passage from Marseille on a Greek trader. Having idly soaked in the Mediterranean sun on its deck and passed through the Corinth Canal, I reached Athens and had the exhilaration of finding Lee impatient to start our journey." We've no idea at what point in this journey he decided to write his poem, The Road is Wider Than Long. He suggests the idea came to him when he arrived back in London, but certainly he was gathering material right from the start. From Athens, they went to the islands of Mykonos and Delos. They were naturally fascinated by the beautiful windmills and the architecture that seemed to have Cubist inspiration at its core. On the beach, bizarrely, the otherwise tranquility was shattered by a hurdy-gurdy with players cranking their splendidly decorated instrument. And of course children. Children everywhere, fascinated by the sight of these strange foreigners. But Lee quickly made friends with them. But note, the boy on the right is making a Nazi salute. He no doubt thinks this is a cool thing to do. We're 1938. And this illustrates how pernicious fascist propaganda like that had infiltrated to a remote beach in Greece. Back on the mainland, they headed to Corinth, down to Napulia, before doubling back to Epidaurus. The vast and fabulous amphitheatre with its acoustical brilliance fascinated them both. And then on to Delphi, the home of the oracle, and that clearly intrigued them. Perhaps Roland was wondering if the oracle, named Pythia, had a surrealist connections to the subconscious. Pythia's oracular predictions were aided by inhaling a naturally occurring gas that emanated from a cleft in the rock. In The Road is Wider Than Long, Roland wrote, "Vapours escape from the rocks, writing tomorrow's news in the sky. We have forgotten yesterday, and tomorrow's news is bad news." Tomorrow's news would be bad news. Roland had been involved in the Spanish Civil War as a non-combatant and was acutely aware of the inexorable threat of the Nazis. They visited the ancient battlefield of Thermopylae next, on the way to the monasteries of Meteora. The 24 monasteries, begun in the 14th century, are built on rock pinnacles, accessible only over perilously rickety drawbridges. But by now the inhabitants were glad to welcome their new visitors. From Meteora, they went north to the port of Kavala, famous for its olives and its cheeses. And on the way they were fascinated by the agriculture, which seemed a communal event with masses of people farming this harsh ground. The harvest had been gathered and the wheat laid on the ground. A group of horses all roped together were repeatedly driven back and forth across the wheat, their hooves effectively flailing the grain from out of the ears. Back-breaking, dusty work, but Lee records the festive atmosphere when the workers stopped for lunch and kindly offered to share their food and drink. In Kavala, Roland was fascinated by the draped statue of Mehmet Ali Pasha, the 19th century Ottoman ruler of Egypt. Roland photographed the statue. I've never learned why it was draped, but later that year Roland used the mysterious image of the statue in his painting titled Enemy the Sun. From Kavala they continued north to Sofia in Bulgaria and on to Bucharest, one of their main objectives. It was here they sought out Harry Browner, the brother of Victor Browner, a surrealist artist and friend of Roland's in London. Harry was professor of music at Bucharest University. His passion was collecting recordings on Edison wax cylinders of the many different types of folk music at that time. Here he is recording Maria Laretu, the famous folk singer, known as Maritza. Some of these recordings have been digitalized and they're available today. Harry's partner was the artist Lina Constante, who Lee described as looking like a Byzantine mosaic saint. She later put herself at risk by founding the Tandrika Puppet Theatre, where the puppets had stridently anti-Nazi attitudes. When Lee and Roland arrived with the wonderful resources of a car and a camera and money, Harry immediately seized the opportunity to ask them to travel with him to the remote areas and photograph the rural traditions. Their adventure actually began in Bucharest with an itinerant troupe of Calusari dancers who Roland was later to host in London. Lee recalled, "They dance noisily, jumping high in the air with the aid of long poles and shriek at the top of their lungs." For Lee, it was the costumes that interested her, and at Harry's request, she recorded the detail with the eye of a trained observer. On the road, Harry took them on a long, clockwise, circular journey well off the beaten track. It was tough, but Lee's dad was an engineer, and he had encouraged Lee's natural instinct in mechanical things. As a result, she was a competent mechanic. And by using her American ingenuity, she could fix most things, and that was a big help as the overwrought springs of the Packard broke and punctured the fuel tank. She plugged the hole with a huge wad of chewing gum and got going again. Totally involved with Harry's request to record folk music and customs, they travelled widely through the small villages in remote areas. Harry knew where the festivals and customary rituals were taking place and managed an itinerary to include the ones where there would be gathering of people who still wore the regional costumes that he most wanted to have recorded photographically. They arrived at the Greek Orthodox monastery of Targogiu in the Gorj district, about 250 kilometers west of Bucharest, during the 3-day Parastas feast. Harry probably took his own notes, but we've never seen them. Instead, we have a manuscript Lee wrote when she returned to Romania in 1946 after the war. She wrote, "Peasant families arrive on beautifully painted carts or decorated covered wagons. The lawn of the monastery is spread with cakes, meats, cheeses, and homemade wines. Thousands of tapers are lit, and while the head priest blesses the offerings, the beggars are ecstatic, and everyone goes down the mountain to dance the hora on the plains." The festival was under the aegis of the church, but for these people, though, held deeply pagan beliefs that were just below the surface. And for them, in their desperately hard lives, invoking and appeasing a wide range of deities was a pragmatic necessity. And Roland and Lee and Harry and Lena were passionately interested in the rituals that had remained unchanged for centuries, like the Paparuda rain dance. Lee wrote, In the gypsy rites to produce a rainfall, a boy and a girl are dressed in leaves arranged like Hawaiian skirts. They prance around singing a primitive prayer ditty while adults throw buckets of water over them. The peasant's ritual harks back to a ceremony as ancient as the oldest of Greek literature. Well, it worked. The effect of the ritual was delayed, though, and a few days later the skies opened and heavy rain made some of the roads nearly impassable. In the Oltenia district in the northwest, they witnessed the Kaloian fertility ceremony, seemingly derived from ancient ritual sacrifice. Lee's notes continue. The pure, that is, children under the age of 10, fashion a moist clay doll in relief on a board. Gentians make blue eyes and a scarlet petal the mouth. The sex is well defined. It's trimmed in flowers, wreathed and laden with fruits, and the children marched, heads wreathed in flowers, lighted tapers in hand, carrying the doll like pallbearers to the nearest remaining water on the parched plains, singing Christian melodies. With suitable prayers and sacrifice symbolic of one of themselves, is placed on the water where it floats away to a death by drowning. Later I learned that the Kaloian ritual was derived from an original rite where a child was sacrificed to ensure the fertility of the crops and animals. Now they did it with a clay model. That's a better choice, I think. These people lived in harmony with their environment in a way unimaginable today. Politically, they had learned to survive under the dominance of major powers in the area who for centuries had regularly fought each other, taking and retaking this land. Herbal medicines, religion and witchcraft were their defense against disease and pestilence. Strong but snug houses protected them against the weather. In some areas, tobacco was a cash crop, and the drying leaves hung garlanding the houses. Most homes had a wooden trough in which the bread was made, the baby was rocked, and hair was washed. No plumbing existed anywhere. It was all troughs like this and water drawn from the well and carried in buckets. The children learned to play the busium, an alpine horn twice the length of this little lady. And at the local fair, people came, bringing wonders from the outside world, entertainment and excitement. The itinerant photographer provided the opportunity for a family photograph as a talisman against change. We don't know if it was Lee's interest in fashion that prompted her to dress in peasant costume. She was fascinated by the self-sufficiency of these people, and she had to find out as much as she could about how the wool and the flax were spun and woven. But if the costume was an attempt at disguise to enable her to blend with the surroundings, it must have been a total failure. She was the only blonde for miles around, and her innate friendliness made disguise unnecessary. Roland, Lee, Harry and Lena knew this charmed existence was about to be swept away by the fast approaching tide of war, and for some this process of persecution had already begun. In Transylvania, about 200 kilometers north of Bucharest, they encountered groups of Roma gypsy people. The authorities, partly out of fear of the gypsies spreading typhoid, had forbidden them to move and to enter the markets, and denied access to the markets. They were not able to sell their livestock, and great poverty and hardship ensued. It amounted to the end of their way of life, and in many cases, ending their lives. For a nomadic culture, to stop moving means you start dying. Lee recorded as much of this as she could. Her shots are beautifully composed and often have a surrealist quirk. We have a strong sense she set up some scenes to get the ideal shot. On the other hand, Roland's shots, for this is one, we can gauge he was much less intrusive as a photographer. Indeed, he tended to wait until people's awareness was elsewhere, usually directed at Lee, who was clearly the centre of attention, and using her as a distraction, Roland would get his shots, catching a naturalness in the people that's evident even when they're looking straight at him. He didn't flinch from photographing the emotionally charged funeral of this little girl. And again we see his non-invasive manner. He's a discreet observer. Later, this would be part of the poem in a way that showed he had absorbed the folklore customs and beliefs that underpinned the way of life of these people. Roland had pressing business in London to get back for, so he reluctantly tore himself away from Lee in Bucharest, boarded a train bound for London via Paris. After Roland had left, Lee continued to travel with Harry and Lena. She wrote to Roland, "Bitch-faced here is a wreck. We ran smack into Tsigan horse thieves and mud above the battery level last night in the drizzling rain, and just a mile from our destination, a burning gas mine. All the chalk cliffs and mountains to the horizon were lit up by the red flames in waves of light, the earth trembling with small subterranean shocks and mad tropical birds flying in and through the flames. Tremendous glowing heat from a column of flame miles high, and more exciting than Vesuvius, with great billowing smoke, pools of oil and water with gas bubbling through, only waiting for a shock or a spark to burst into activity." On his way home, Roland found a different kind of activity, but even more deadly. Passing through Munich, he found the portent of things to come. The station was decked out with thousands of Nazi flags in honor of Chamberlain's appeasement visit to Hitler. Perhaps that increased Roland's determination to make a record of his experience. Much later he wrote, "On my return to London, I was seized by a desire to celebrate this brief and stimulating Balkan adventure in some enduring form. Since I'd never kept a diary of daily events, I put together my memories of this scenery and the people that Lee and I had enjoyed and the events we had lived through together, making it a scrapbook or a visual diary dedicated to her." And so Roland set to work rendering the adventure into a poem and using images snipped from his contact sheet as placeholders. On the map I showed you earlier, we saw the journey evolve in a linear, sequential form. But the narrative has become a stream of conscious, and the sequence of events is random. Here the olive groves of Kavala immediately precede the Paparuda rain dance of southern Romania, although they were actually separated by several weeks, hundreds of kilometers, and many other events between them. But this corresponds to the way our memories tend to rearrange the sequence of linear events. So Roland is justified in beginning the poem in Meteora, reached about 2 weeks into the adventure. The final manuscript is an artist's photo book in its own right. Using heavy art paper, he's calligraphed the words and tipped in the enlargements of his photos. Roland had the photographs printed by Wallace Heaton, a camera shop known for their good quality works, and it looks like he carefully chose the size for each print. And the book's importance to Roland was far more than an act of self-indulgence. It was a courtship ritual. He wanted Lee to leave Aziz, to move to London and marry him, and his poem invokes their intimacy. Lovers who escape, who are free to separate, free to reunite, leave their tongues plaited together, hidden in the dry grass, folded in peasant cloth, embalmed in the green memories of desire. Then the journeys alone that fill the world become fertile. In each tower, on each headland, as the frontier is passed, lovers watching for the red train have grown into each other's eyes. The colour of their hope is the white feather of a volcano, the blue eye which opens in the clouds before sunset, the stage of a Greek theatre echoing the smile that drops from her lips. Like bats they make love by day, their heads buried in the stones, their feet searching for lions in the hills. These lines precede a photo of the amphitheatre of Epidaurus, and Roland has skillfully collaged the landscape photo above the amphitheatre as a fantasy background for the scene. Perhaps it also relates to the lines, "the blue eye which opens in the cloud before sunset," the stage of a Greek theatre echoing the smile that drops from her lips. Do you remember Man Ray's Lips? If that smile dropped on that little round stone there, you would certainly hear it. And actually, if you drop a coin on that stone, as you probably know, you can hear it sitting up in the back row of the amphitheatre. Roland had the pages professionally bound, done with great care and skill, and as for the covers, he chose the sort of leather used for the soles of high-quality shoes. It became a beautiful object, charged with love and intimate memories. And then the next step was the first printed version. Roland found a large quantity of surplus covers made with wood veneer, intended to be used for a book of common prayer. And the artist Hans Bellmer designed the typography. We don't know the name of Roland's printer at the Bradley Press, but clearly he had great technical ability and a touching generosity in making his big selection of different fonts available to Roland in an unlimited choice. We see the typeface varies from one line to the next. The original layout was made with this widely varied use of monotype. There must have been several impressions to accommodate the colour on the page. As a surrealist, Roland was very familiar with the precursor of surrealism, the Dada movement. And we see in Roland's page layouts that he felt an affinity with Dadaist anarchistic views and the liberating way they deliberately broke the rules of composition and format and everything else. But in Roland's poetry, there's a definitely surrealist style. And it's different from his friend Paul Éluard in that Roland has a narrative quality. He engages with the world, examines it through the lens of surrealism, and shares his findings with us. Take this sequence about the funeral of the young Romanian peasant child. How imprudent of you to have died. Oh, how we missed you. When your father comes home, you will not be there to hold his bicycle. Why have you not kissed me for 3 days? Why don't you smile? Oh, darling, how we miss you. Wrenchingly, the poem goes on, lamenting the loss. Oh, my darling, how we miss you. How unkind of you to die. That line poignantly carries the grief of bereavement. Yet the child's spirit is sternly warned not to try and return. But should you try to come back, you will suffer more than us. The ropes that bind you are strong. The horse that leads us to your grave, the tree that dies with you will be torn down. Your heart will be filled with knives. For me, the death of the child can also be seen as a metaphor for the death of these innocent people's way of life at the hands of the Nazis. Some years ago, the subsequent owner of Roland's studio found the actual plate for this image, damaged but still legible, and a reminder that some losses seem to be eternal. At this time, Roland owned the London Gallery in Cork Street. Commencing a year earlier, he and his manager, Edouard Mezens, had published a London bulletin, which ran right up to June 1940. And it was under this imprint that Roland published The Road is Wider Than Long in June 1939. Note the reference to the coloured type and illustrations. Roland clearly had an eye on unique selling properties. On sale at the Zwemmer Gallery, that was another coup, because later in 1939, Zwemmer mounted his famous surrealist show, featuring artists including work by both Penrose and Miller. The book got reviews. Mr. Laker of the West Lothian Courier liked it but found the poetry unintelligible. He felt more at home with Kipling. And Stephen Spender of the New Statesman found the poems and photographs pretentious and dull. From the surviving papers, it seems there's a possibility of a French publication, but the war put a stop to that. The first edition, printed at the Bradley Press, was limited to 510 copies. 10 copies were on handmade paper, and Roland used them as personal gifts with special dedication and hand-painted illuminations in the form of these little details in watercolour. Simple designs, sometimes cabalistic. They sit well with the printed colour, and the font changes. The Delphi oracle, Pythia, was a woman. So here Roland gives us a woman and a mountain as interchangeable elements. Copy number 1 was for Lee. Lee, who caught me in her cup of gold, the dedication reads. Beautiful, poetic, discreet. Lee was still married to Aziz, so Roland's words had to be oblique enough to avoid leading to an embarrassing confrontation. Excuse me. The little drawing of the sailing boat comes from an object he made in 1936 titled Le Paradis des Alouettes. The pince-nez spectacles belonged to his maiden aunt. In the drawing, they're doubled, perhaps a metaphor for the forward movement of life being driven along by the way we see. A few weeks after publication, Roland headed for Egypt, ostensibly as the photographer attached to a field trip by the dance expert Beryl de Zoete. The role was his cover, and it was important because he wanted to avoid embarrassing Aziz. Aziz knew about Roland. Lee had been honest with him, and Roland was anxious to avoid humiliating him in front of his friends and society. He found her on a friend's cotton farm in the Upper Nile at Asyut. He bore with him as gifts the first copy of The Road is Wider Than Long and a pair of gold handcuffs. Lee said she found both presents thoroughly captivating. Aziz knew Lee was unhappy in their marriage, but he said he wasn't going to let her go until she found somebody who could love her as much as he did, could look after her as well as he did. And when he met Roland, he realized that moment had come. She'd found the right person, and he gave her his blessing. He gave her money. He gave her a boat ride ticket to London, and he gave her his undying love until he died the same year that she did. Lee arrived in London after travelling around in Europe with Roland, 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany. As an American, she could have easily gone back to the United States and sat out the war in comfort, but she would have felt she was deserting her friends like Paul and Noosh. She stayed in London. Eventually, she became a war correspondent for the US Army, accredited to Vogue magazine. She was ashore soon after D-Day, reporting on the people in the field hospitals just back of Omaha Beach. Then her next scoop, she became a combat photographer, a role completely forbidden to women, as she covered the siege of St. Malo for 5 days. And then the liberation of Paris. But she wasn't going to stay in Paris. The fiercest fighting of the whole war was on in the winter of 44-45, and she was there when the Allies punched into Germany and began liberating the concentration camps. Her photographs were published mostly in America by American Vogue, and very few in Britain. After the war, Roland's own work as an artist took second place to his biography of Picasso and curating his 1960 Picasso show at the Tate. In 1964, he curated the Miro retrospective at the Tate and wrote his biography of the artist. He followed this with his biography of Man Ray in 76 and the Catalan artist Antony Penrose in 78. In 1980, the Arts Council gave Roland a major retrospective that toured several venues in England and ended at Fundació Juan Miró in Barcelona. And they also published a facsimile of The Road is Wider Than Long. It has to be said the photographic reproduction of this version was not as good, and Roland noted that here on the proof. And looking further at Roland's marginalia, we can see that at the age of 80 he has lost nothing of his critical faculty. The following year, he published his autobiography, Scrapbook, which featured a double page on The Road is Wider Than Long. In this way, he acknowledged the importance of in his life of the book and the adventure it narrated. In 2003, Roland's work featured in a major Lee Miller exhibition at the J.P. Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And for this, they recreated an accurate facsimile of the first 1939 edition. And to do this, we scanned the printed version and then scanned the photographs from the original MS. And the Getty inserted them. It worked beautifully, and the images regained their clarity. We took one liberty, which was to recreate the collage on this page, which had become a drawing, and we remade it with the image from the original manuscript. And the importance of this little photo book goes beyond the beguiling personal story it tells. There are very few other surrealist photo books from this period, with the most notable being Man Ray's work. This folio of rayographs titled Electricité in 1931, but it's not really a photo book. It's a folio collection of images. There's no narrative, there's no poem. But it was Man Ray who created what seems to be the only other major surrealist photo book, titled Facile. Published in 1935, it's Paul Éluard's poem, inspired by his fascination of his wife, Noosh, and Man Ray's images of her feature throughout, integrated with the text. It's another love story, with Noosh, life, mystery, and love celebrated in Paul's words and Man Ray's images. The Road is Wider Than Long Getty version sold out years ago, and we've just self-published a new version of the London Gallery version to make it accessible again. It's as faithful to the original as we can get, and where possible, we've reprinted the images from the original negatives. We've also made an edition of the replica with the original leather-bound manuscript. So for the first time, other people can enjoy the charm and the beauty of Roland's calligraphy and the page layouts. It's a great pleasure to own and turn the pages of a book that up until now has been a museum object that few people have had the pleasure of holding in their hands. Interest in Roland's work is rising. We want to help this little book secure its place in the history of surrealist literature. But what became of the people? Roland and Lee married in 1947, a few months before I was born. Their marriage was fraught with extreme difficulties because after the war, Lee suffered terribly from post-traumatic stress disorder. Didn't even have a name in those days, and the answer for millions of people was to put up, shut up, and drink a lot of whiskey. And unsurprisingly, she entered a downward spiral of alcohol abuse and depression. And Roland hadn't a clue what to do, but intuitively he thought that if she had a nice, quiet place in the country, it would help her recover. So in 1949, 75 years ago, we moved here in March, Farley Farmhouse in Sussex. And Roland immediately personalised it by painting this mural in the fireplace. And Lee fought back hard against her depression. She reinvented herself as a gourmet chef and was celebrated in the pages of Vogue and House and Garden magazine, and surrealism hit the kitchen head on. We had dishes like blue spaghetti, green chicken, gold meatloaf, and pink breasts made of cauliflower. And it was a moment of great decision before I brought my girlfriends home for supper. Lee and Roland rediscovered a harmony that endured for the remainder of Lee's life. But it wasn't a moment too soon. In 1977, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She lived just long enough to meet Amy. That's our first baby daughter, born to my late wife, Susanna, and me. In 1985, Thames and Hudson published my biography of my mother, The Lives of Lee Miller. And right now, it has just become a movie. It will be out in the cinemas in the 13th of September. And with a bit of luck, I'll be able to run the trailer for you.
Why does it matter? They're just pictures.
Do you want the world to know about you?
You think I went to war so people would know my name? I'm heading to the front. Ready to go?
We don't send women to combat.
Well, that's a problem, because I'm here. Even when I wanted to look away.
September the 13th, you'll be able to form your own opinion of it, and I hope you like it. It's tough. It really is. It's a very hard-hitting movie. And it's very much about a woman. It's made by Kate Winslet herself as a producer. Kate Solomon is the other producer. The two writers are both women, Marion Hume and Liz Hanna. And the director's a woman, Ellen Kuras. And for me, this is why it works, because it's a movie about a woman made by women. Do you remember Valentine? Yep. She was in India when the war broke out. She hopped on a liner. She wanted to come back and join the French army to fight the Germans. Too late. France fell. She arrived in London, and completely by accident she met Lee Miller. Neither woman knew the identity of the other, but they became incredibly close friends from that moment onwards. And Valentine was a frequent visitor to Farley Farm. Here she is, charming a snake that she's just found, like it was some cobra in an Indian market. I was very fond of her. She lived with us for long periods, and she died at Farley's 1978, a year after Lee. And Roland was devastated by her death because in less than a year, he had lost the two most important women in his whole life. Fortunately, my wife, Susanna, my late wife, took him over, and she made sure there were things to do, places to go, people to meet, exhibitions to attend, anything to fill that void. And he began making collages again. He had a French girlfriend. They went to Paris, and the collages reflected those journeys. They went to Kenya. They went further to Sri Lanka. In 1982 and 83, he had two shows of new work, one in London and one in Paris. He had a third, much bigger exhibition planned for 1984. He went to the Seychelles in February, and when he came back, he had a massive stroke. It took out most of everything, but he still continued to plan for the show, telling me with great difficulty this was to be called The Last One. And you can see it was. You can see the bird taking off, gathering speed, leaving behind the things that he had loved, the beautiful beaches populated by lovely young women in bikinis, and flying towards this thing here, Lee's lips in the bottom corner, like Man Ray's, had them floating in the sky, but Roland always used them vertically tilted. That was his motif for Lee. And finally, he slipped away very peacefully on Lee's birthday at home, the 23rd of April, 1984. And I am quite sure of what happened after that, because it just picks up where they left off. And when I'm alone in the old house late at night, I can hear the popping of wine corks, the laughter, the arguments going on, all the fun they're having. And I'm pretty sure they're making some great art. But we still have, for the moment, the art they left behind. Farley's is open to the public. The little lady in the middle there, showing the guests around, that is the baby you met previously. That is my daughter, Amy, who now runs the place. She's my co-director. We have a gallery in which we have exhibitions of children's work every 2 years, but normally it's filled up with work by Lee and her associates. We have another gallery in an old cow barn, and the old house in the sculpture garden. Be glad to welcome you back. But if you want to come, please book. We have a limited number of places on our tours, so hop on the website. I hope you've enjoyed this story about my parents, their lives, and some of the things they created, and that you see that this little book is not only a tender and surrealist love poem, but a unique photo book in its own right. And thank you for being such a warm and friendly and supportive audience. It's been a pleasure to bring my parents here to meet you. Thank you. the incredibly fortunate thing about working with Kate Winslet is that she has an absolute rigid determination that it should be authentic. And so whilst I didn't have a yes-no approval, I had the opportunity to try and talk them out of things which were either not accurate or inappropriate. And they listened, and I was very pleased with the way that we worked together. So I feel the film is a really good, accurate representation of Lee's life. Of course, we're cramming a lifetime into 2 hours. You have to shorten things up, miss out things, edit things like crazy. But I think it works well because it carries the essence of Lee and the things that she stood for and thought were important.
I think Gillian Anderson, although I don't like her work, I think she would be a better choice, frankly.
A better choice of what, director or?
Well, but who's playing the father?
Who's playing Roland?
Father?
Alexander Skarsgård. Yes.
Nice.
And lots of people go, ooh, because he's terribly good looking.
Another question?
Talk. Did they ever return to Greece and Balkans after the
Lee went back in 1945. She went back as far as Romania, went to Bucharest, and it was terribly, terribly difficult because there was so much threat and persecution by the secret police and that sort of thing. She had to be very careful about who she associated with, what she wrote about, and so on. And so her writing and is very kind of oblique in that moment. Then much later, they did go back to Athens, and I forget what it was, but there was some amazing arts festival there that they both went back for. And so they went back to Athens and really rather loved it. And that was sort of like by the early 70s, I think, yes. So they never lost their affection for it. And certainly Lee never lost her affection for Greek food. And there was always things that were popping up in her menus because she had associated, well, because she discovered them in Greece. And so, yes, she kind of never lost her affection for the country.
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk, because it also gives a very personal insight, which is, I always appreciate that. And my question was because in the end, did she ever publish any books about her food, or is there any collections of recipes of this kind of?
Yes, that's a lovely question, because most certainly there is, and I'm terribly proud of it because it was written by my daughter Amy. It took her 10 years to research it. And the book is like this thick, which is why I didn't bring any with me. But if you want it, you can get on our website, Farley's House and Gallery, and you'll find it there. And it's a really fun book because Amy's kind of captured the joie de vivre that Lee had with her cooking, the experimentation, all the different kind of weird things that she would come up with. And Lee did start writing her own cookbook. It was about using a freezer, because you have to realize that in the late 60s, the freezer was still a kind of quite a new piece of technology. But she didn't finish it because she became ill. And when Amy was researching, she found letters between Lee and her agent in New York, who was going to oversee the publication of this book, and got in touch with a lady who invited us to visit her, and she gave us all the manuscripts, all the correspondence, everything back again, and that is now incorporated in Lee's, in Amy's cookbook. So there you go. It's called Food, Friends and Faraway Places, I think. That's the title.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you so much again. It was a fascinating storytelling. I can't wait to see the books. I know you've got them out there. I wanted to ask you, in The Road is Wider Than Long, the book, the photographs, were they only your father's, or did they ever consider, and it's a twofold question, this was obviously not the work, they didn't consider it as artwork. They were just recording as they were going along, presumably, in Greece and Romania and all the journeys. Did they ever, you think, consider it as a joint project together, or no authorship, really? They didn't demand any authorship, and whether...
They did do joint projects together, and Lee wrote very, very movingly and convincingly for some of the catalogues of exhibitions that Roland created. And she also photographed extensively. When he was writing about Picasso, we've got more than 1,000 shots of Picasso. The same with the other artists like Miro and Man Ray and Tapies and others. She was always supporting Roland by taking pictures, sometimes with the idea of them being used in the book or publicity or even just as an aide-memoire. So there was this sort of synergistic effect all the time. But the road is wider than long. He left the journey early. And so he took his rolls of film back with him and he developed them in London, which is why I happen to say they're slightly better developed than Lee's, which were developed possibly somewhere en route or maybe in Cairo. And you might have noticed that some of them show signs of uneven developing. And that is because her batch, was developed independently. Now, she was mainly shooting with the idea of providing images for Harry Browner, but that never happened. So she just bundled the whole lot up together. Unfortunately, when she left Egypt, she took it with her. And it was part of the stash that we found in the attic of our old farmhouse after she had died. And, there was something like 60,000 negatives. And we found them, and it took us, about 3-4 years to actually get them into any kind of order at all. And that was the beginning of the Lee Miller archive. So the two were two separate collections of photography. But now we've combined Roland's photography, but not, we don't mix them up. We keep them as under separate authors. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Like people say, it's an absolutely wonderful, personalised story. I love the books, and I love the ones that you've written particularly.
Thank you.
Please don't forget the boy who bit Picasso. You're in front of us tonight.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for that. Well, it was partly the fact that they knew Harry Browner and they were heading for him because they knew that he could insert them into the underlayer of ethnographic culture in that country. Every place else they would have gone, Greece included, they would have kind of not had that entree. But they knew that they were in for a fantastic adventure because he knew where to go. He knew which festivals to show up at. He could speak the language and he could explain what was going on. And there was a purpose to it, to help him with his researches. So the whole thing fitted together nicely. If maybe there had been some wonderful Greek friend who had taken them around the back blocks of Greece, that would have been equally fascinating. But what they loved doing was to get in under the surface, to really make a connection. And, you can see in the Greek photographs how they're very, very comfortable sharing food and drinks with the farm working people, That's a sort of... They weren't interested in the rich people, in the intellectual people and so on. They wanted to find out what the real guys of the country were all about. And that's why Romania at that level was so interesting to them. And thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. If there's any other
Maybe a generic question, but how has been to be the son of Lee Miller and Roland Penrose?
How has it been to be the son of Lee Miller and Roland Penrose? Well, look, it's great. I'm here now. I'm having a lovely time. I've been all over the world. I mean, it's been 45 years on this game. And I've had the most fantastic adventures. I've been places and met people and so on. Being the son of Lee Miller as a kid was not fun, because she was an alcoholic for the first 20 years of my life. And you may understand that this produces its own kind of difficulty, because she was never violent. She didn't need to be, because she could do all the damage she wanted with words. But you see, she'd be fun and friendly and lovely, and then one drink too many, which was completely incomprehensible to me as a child, bam, monster time. And she would be very cruel, very unkind, and so on. So as I grew up, I started to hit back. And as a teenager, I declared war on her. And that was really when the sparks started to fly. But I went overseas, I came back, married to Susanna, and we moved into a house on the farm. And the first thing that Susanna did was invite Lee to dinner. I said, "What do you mean? That's the enemy." And Susanna said, "She's not my enemy, and if you shut up long enough, you'll find she wants to be your friend." So I did what I was told, and Lee and I became friends. And it was great. It was so good. It was so warm and honest and open. It wasn't mother and son stuff. We were like two battle-scarred warriors who wished we'd been fighting on the same side after all. So we got it together in the end, because she just died 2 years later. And, you know, I'm just so happy that I had even that short, brief period with her being, you know, a good friend. Thank you.
So finally, let's do one big thank you to Antony.
Oh, you've done that already. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. You're very kind people.